Good evening. Tonight we're going to be talking about dreams, and this will be Dreams Session 4. And so just to warm up, to give a few people time to join us, I thought I would again read a few quotes from C.G. Jung's Psychological Reflections, a new anthology of his writings, 1905 to 1961, edited by Yolanda Jacobi and R.F.C. Hull, published by Princeton University Press. So these will be short quotes and with references to the volumes of the collected works in which Dr. Jung placed them. Thank you for joining me. I'm about to be reading a few quotes just to warm up, and these will be quotes about dreams in keeping with our topic this evening. Here's the first one. The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul, opening into that cosmic night which was psyche long before there was any ego consciousness, and which will remain psyche no matter how far our ego consciousness extends. For all ego consciousness is isolated, because it separates and discriminates. It knows only particulars, and it sees only those that can be related to the ego. Its essence is limitation, even though it reached to the farthest nebulae among the stars. All consciousness separates, but in dreams we put on the likeness of that more universal, truer, more eternal man dwelling in the darkness of primordial night. There he is still the whole, and the whole is in him, indistinguishable from nature and bare of all egohood. It is from these all-uniting depths that the dream arises, be it never so childish, grotesque, and immoral. That comes from Volume 10, which is Civilization in Transition, paragraph 304 and following. Here's another quote. No amount of skepticism and criticism has yet enabled me to regard dreams as negligible occurrences. Often enough they appear senseless, but it is obviously we who lack the sense and ingenuity to read the enigmatic message from the nocturnal realm of the psyche. Seeing that at least half our psychic existence is passed in that realm, and that consciousness acts upon our nightly life just as much as the unconscious overshadows our daily life, it would seem all the more incumbent on medical psychology to sharpen its senses by a systematic study of dreams. Nobody doubts the importance of conscious experience. Why then should we doubt the significance of unconscious happenings? They also are part of our life, and sometimes more truly a part of it for weal or woe than any happenings of the day. That's from Volume 16 of the Collected Works, The Practice of Psychotherapy, paragraph 325. Good evening and welcome to our 99th regular weekly meeting of the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group. I'm just reading a couple of more quotes before we get into the main topic of the evening. Give people a little time to join us. Dreams are impartial, spontaneous products of the unconscious psyche, outside the control of the will. They are pure nature. They show us the unvarnished, natural truth, and are therefore fitted, as nothing else is, to give us back an attitude that accords with our basic human nature when our consciousness has strayed too far from its foundations and run into an impasse. That's from Volume 10, Civilization in Transition, paragraph 317. And one more from this book. As in our waking state, real people and things enter our field of vision, so the dream images enter like another kind of reality into the field of consciousness of the dream ego. We do not feel as if we were producing the dreams. It is rather as if the dreams came to us. They are not subject to our control, but obey their own laws. They are obviously autonomous psychic complexes. Which form themselves out of their own material. We do not know the source of their motives, and we therefore say that dreams come from the unconscious. In saying this, we assume that there are independent psychic complexes which elude our conscious control and come and go according to their own laws. That comes from The Psychological Foundations of Belief in Spirits, from Volume 8, The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, paragraph 580. So I've been reading just in this last few minutes from C.G. Jung, Psychological Reflections, a new anthology of his writings, 1905 to 1961. Now, my friend Louis LaFontaine sent me another piece a couple of days ago, and this is from the Collected Letters, and Louis maintains a site called Carl Jung Depth Psychology site.blog, and he also is the organizer of the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Facebook page. And when I joined that page in 2005, there were about 4,000 members. Today, there are over 62,000. So Dr. Jung's work is becoming more and more popular. So the question is, Carl Jung on why we experience a lack of dreams. This is to J.O. Pearson. Dear Dr. Pearson, 29 August 1959. The lack of dreams has different reasons. The ordinary reason is that one is not interested in the mental life within, and one does not. The ordinary reason is that one is not interested in the mental life within, and one does not pay attention to anything of this kind. Another reason is that one has not dealt enough with one's conscious problem and waits for dreams so that the unconscious would do something about it. And the third reason is that the dreams have, as it were, emigrated into a person in our surroundings, who then is dreaming in an inordinate way. A fourth reason, finally, can be a mental condition, in which dreams are redundant inasmuch as compensations for the conscious attitude are not needed. A light sleep is certainly a favorable condition for the remembrance of dreams. There is certainly a great difference between dreams. According to a primitive classification, there are big dreams and small ones. The example you describe is obviously a big dream of very particular importance. The small dreams are the ordinary stuff of unconscious fantasies, which become perceptible, particularly in light sleep. Sincerely yours, C.G. Jung, Carl Jung Letters, Volume 2, page 514. And so if you go to the Carl Jung Depth Psychology site.blog, you can put your email address in, and my friend Lewis will send you brief quotes from Dr. Jung every day in your email. And I've been appreciating these lately. So how is everyone tonight? We seem to have gathered a crowd, so we can begin. I just wanted to mention, Stephen Larson says, did Jung speak of lucid dreams? Does Jung analysis of dreams apply to lucid dreams? I'll answer the first question, or the last question first. Yes, it does. And I believe he did, but at the moment I cannot give you a citation for that. But what you can do, Stephen, is if you are a member of our Dropbox, simply go into volume 20 of the Collected Works of C.G. Jung, which is the index. And in that volume 20, you can simply do a word search on lucid dreams, and I'm sure you can find very many examples of where he has talked about it in his oeuvre. And then you can find those citations directly. If you are not a member of our Dropbox, please send an email to skip.conover@gmail.com. That's me. And it has to be from a regular email address because that's required by Dropbox. And I will put you in our Dropbox. There are a lot of very useful items there. Now, this evening we are continuing on. This is a very long essay. We're working from C.G. Jung Dreams with a foreword by Sonu Shamdasani. And this is a collection of essays on dreams that Dr. Jung wrote at different times in his career. So there are essays that come in 4 different volumes of the Collected Works of C.G. Jung. And so this is a collection of those essays just on dreams. And let me just see if there's an index. There is. So let me just look here for lucid dreams. I don't see lucid dreams in the index here. So I don't know what that means. I don't think it's definitive. Now, as you see, I mark up my paragraphs very much. And everywhere there's an underlining and a star, I probably could write a 500-word essay on exactly what Dr. Jung said in that particular moment. And so I'm resuming. We're working on the essay called General Aspects of Dream Psychology. I'm on page 43, if you have this book. And we're going to begin with paragraph 494. So in 494, so anyway, the point I was going to make is that what I am doing in terms of this group is trying to highlight some of the high points in these paragraphs, but they're extremely complex. And so you'll need to go buy the book and read the book. I'm just trying to give you an overall sense of where we are and what is being said. So in paragraph 494, Dr. Jung says that beware of overestimating the significance of dreams. It's better to assume that the unconscious and conscious are about equally important. And do I like tea or coffee? Well, I would love to have some decaf chai right now, but my voice took heavies from this morning when I did a 2.5-hour reading, and I encourage everyone to go take a look at the 3 videos that I put on the site in the last 3 days. It's It's called Mysterium Encounter, and it was 30 pages from the Red Book, and then Dr. Jung's own commentary on those 30 pages. And then today I read the footnotes, and it turned out that the footnotes were the longest reading yet. And so my voice took heavies. But in any case, I think it's extremely important. And those 30 pages, the Mysterium Encounter, really informed Dr. Jung for his book called Psychological Types, which is volume 6 of the Collected Works. And it's a very thick book. And so I urge you to take a look at it. And one of the interesting things about it is that in the back of it, there are many definitions from Jungian psychology, and the definitions alone take up about 140 pages. But for example, the definition for individuation takes 6 pages, I believe. Sean says, there is so much dense information, absolutely. And Stephen says, I understood lucid dreams were just confirmed as real scientifically in the 1980s. If true, I'd expect the term would not be used by Jung, but perhaps by another name. Yes, I suppose that's probably true. I'm familiar with them because of I'm peripherally involved with Tibetan Buddhism, as you can see here, because I'm married to a lay Tibetan Buddhist teacher. She's not Tibetan, but she's been studying Tibetan Buddhism since 1963 and completed a 3-year retreat. She did it as a home retreat. It took her 7 years, but she did do that. And so she's one of the leading teachers of Tibetan Buddhism in this area, in my area. So we often are comparing notes between Tibetan Buddhism and Jungian psychology because, among other things, Dr. Jung was impressed with the parallels between Tibetan Buddhism and his psychology. And he did write the foreword to several books on Tibetan Buddhism, including the Tibetan Book of the Dead and Suzuki's book on Zen Buddhism. So at least both of those, and he wrote many other forewords for other religious texts. Sean suggests maybe I should drink the iced tea with honey for the throat before reading. That probably is not a bad idea. In fact, excuse me just a moment. I'm going to go ask my wife. It sounds so good. I'm going to ask her to make me some chai. I'll be right back. Give me a minute. Hey, Deb.
Yeah?
Could you make me a large cup of chai with honey in it? Because the honey I need for my voice. Okay. All right. Sorry for that interruption, but I think my voice probably needs it since I've already done 2.5 hours online today. I remember years ago Diane Rehm having to go out and have voice treatments, and I'm not sure I'm up to voice treatments. So anyway, Stephen, in terms of lucid dreams, Tibetan Buddhists do talk about it all the time. And it's a topic that my wife often talks about, and she's been doing it. Do I lucid dream? No, not so much, but I think it definitely is a thing. Sean says, whenever I get really frustrated or anxious, I read Tao Te Ching to reset, but I wouldn't use it to succeed in the business world. Well, whatever breaks up your sclerosis in your psyche, I guess the way I refer to it is moving the furniture around. You sometimes have to rethink things. And so I used to do tarot readings for people very often. And when I did, I called it moving the furniture around. There's nothing occult about a tarot reading. Basically, it simply constellates some archetypes within your unconscious, makes you think of something that you weren't necessarily thinking about, but that change in attitude sometimes is very beneficial. And I have put an entire teaching on the tarot on this channel. There are 18 videos, so if you want to understand why I do the tarot when I do, it is all there on those 18 videos. That isn't to say that there's anything magical about it. It's simply a way of reading and a way of causing you to think about things differently than you were when you came in the room. But there's nothing magical about it whatsoever. Sean says, me and my mom used to read angel cards in bad times, gave us hope. That's another one that will work just fine. So is reading tea leaves or coffee grounds or Tao Te Ching, as you rightly say, because they cause you to think about things from a different point of view. And that's useful. If you get yourself too tied up in a knot, then you may make the wrong decision. Okay, so I'm still in paragraph 494. So often dreams contribute only the merest fragment to the conscious situation. And then he emphasizes only if there is an obviously unsatisfactory and defective conscious attitude have we a right to allow the unconscious a higher value. So if, he's writing this, I think at that time he was writing this for analysts, and so he was basically trying to give them some tips about how to talk about dreams with their patients. The individual is conditioned by himself and by his collective relationships. If adequate, dreams have a compensatory function. And it gives dreams a compensatory function in the self-regulation of the psychic organism. Now, keep in mind, from Dr. Jung's perspective, everything is based on opposites. And so if you're pulling way far to the right on one day, then your dream may pull you back to the left because you can't just keep going over the edge. And so it compensates your psyche so that you still have psychic energy, so that you keep psychic energy. And then he says in paragraph 495, but when the individual deviates, it becomes a guiding perspective function. So in other words, your unconscious, when you're going off the rails, is going to come up and say, you better do this or that. And it's trying to warn you or something like that. And it's capable of leading the conscious attitude in a different direction. And here he refers to the Nebuchadnezzar type dreams that come up in people that are not living at their true level. They lack all proportions. Their lack of all proportion is very obvious, and therefore dreams often have a perspective value and warn you that you're going to get cut down, basically. And so I'll just go back to Nebuchadnezzar's dream because you may not remember it from last week. The dream appears on page 37 of this book, C.G. Jung Dreams, and it appears in the 4th chapter of the book of Daniel, 10 through 16. So, book of Daniel 4, 10 through 16. When Nebuchadnezzar was at the height of his power, he had the following dream. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. The tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all. The beasts of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all the flesh was fed of it. I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher and an holy one came down from heaven. He cried aloud and said thus, Hew down the tree, and cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, and scatter his fruit. Let the beasts get away from under it, and the fowls from its branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump of its roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass in the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from man's.
It's hot, very hot.
Oh, all right. All right, can you just put it down here? Excuse me.
Okay.
Thank you. You can pull that door shut. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a breast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. And so what Dr. Jung was saying about this dream, I'll just read a little bit further here. This is from paragraph 485. In the second part of the dream, the tree becomes personified, so that it is easy to see that the great tree is the dreaming king himself. Daniel interprets the dream in this sense. Its meaning is obviously an attempt to compensate the king's megalomania, which, according to the story, developed into a real psychosis. To interpret the dream process as compensatory is, in my view, entirely consistent with the nature of the biological process in general. Okay, so that's referring back to Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And let's see. So thank you, Sean, for this idea, and I appreciate it. Very good. And Sean says, have you heard of inviting spirits or entities in? There are imaginative exercises where you imagine a door and a lock where the entities enter. It's sort of a dangerous experience to the psyche, but if you're confident with your ego, you can withstand the journey. I myself have a darker imagination, and I've always imagined weird entities with different names. Okay, so Sean, one thing you're talking about here is active imagination, and you're right that it does take care. I mean, you have to be duly warned, and this is why Dr. Jung felt that people shouldn't really get into his psychology until they're at midlife, because by the time you've reached midlife, you've built up your ego. And remember, the building of your ego is based on the Job archetype, which is contest, defeat, lamentation, and rebirth. And what that means is that if, every time you have a disappointment in life and you survive it, it's basically what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And that happens over and over in everyone's life, or most people's life. And when that happens, it allows you to build your ego bit by bit. And so if you have a weak ego, not a strong ego, you may not be able to withstand the pressure of the unconscious images that are there. And so in one sense, in order to get a understanding of how these things can come up, you ought to go to the Red Book playlist and just hear some of the readings that I've put there. The most recent of those was Dr. Jung's Active Imagination with Elijah and Salome. And you can see that it's quite graphic in the sense that Salome is recognized as the woman who asked for John the Baptist's head on a platter. And that made Dr. Jung very worried while he was in the midst of his active imagination. But because he was a licensed psychiatrist at the time with 15 years experience, and he had served in a mental hospital for many years, and so he was quite familiar with the types of things that could come up. And so he didn't, he felt that he could control them. I don't have my Red Book right in my reach, but hold on just a second. Okay, so in his day, nobody really understood the process of active imagination, and even psychiatry itself was only just beginning at that time. And so the images that came up were extremely graphic, and fortunately he was able to control them. But I want to read to you the epilogue that appears at the end of the Red Book. In the Reader's Edition, it's on page 555. And it's dated 1959. And so this relates to his view of the active imagination, which occurred between 1913 and 1918, I guess. And then he elaborated on it with images that he painted and writing. And if you've seen my earlier videos, you've seen the German calligraphy that he put together. So he created a illuminated manuscript that is the Red Book. But he said this: I worked on this book for 16 years. My acquaintance with alchemy in 1930 took me away from it. The beginning of the end came in 1928 when Wilhelm sent me the text of The Golden Flower, an alchemical treatise. There the contents of this book found their way into actuality, and I could no longer continue working on it. To the superficial observer, it will appear like madness. It would also have developed into one had I not been able to absorb the overpowering force of the original experiences. With the help of alchemy, I could finally arrange them into a whole. I always knew that these experiences contained something precious, and therefore I knew nothing better than to write them down in a precious, that is to say, in a costly book, and to paint the images that emerged through reliving it all as well as I could. I knew how frightfully inadequate this undertaking was, but despite much work and many distractions, I remained true to it, even if another possibility never. And then he ends his epilogue in the middle of that sentence, sort of in the tradition of James Joyce. In the dust jacket, which I've saved here, it says, the years of which I have spoken to you when I pursued the inner images were the most important time of my life. Everything else is to be derived from this. It began at that time, and the later details hardly matter anymore. My entire life consisted in elaborating what had burst forth from the unconscious and flooded me like an enigmatic stream and threatened to break me. That was the stuff and material for more than only one life. Everything later was merely the outer classification, the scientific elaboration, and the integration into life. But the numinous beginning, which contained everything, was then. So, my point in reading that to you, Sean, is that active imagination can be extremely valuable to you, and you need to be able to hold on. So you need to be able to buckle up. And Dr. Jung said that he constantly had to remind himself between his imaginal periods that he was a psychiatrist who had many patients. He lived at 228 or 228 Seestrasse in Zurich. He had a wife and 5 children, etc. And he had to remind himself of his conscious physical life so that he didn't get drawn in and overwhelmed by his unconscious life. And so, I think you can experiment with it. I didn't. And the way it needs to be done is not by forcing an imagination. So you can't, draw a picture of some creature and expect that to go into your imagination. What you need to do is to sit quietly and let your conscious mind step aside, and then let whatever comes from your unconscious, let that come. And I would recommend making notes about it. And that's what I did. So when it occurred to me the first time in 1993, it emerged in the form of a novel over a period of 8 months. And the way I did it every morning, there was a psychogenic entity that woke me up every morning at 6 a.m. and made me go to my computer. And I turned the light on the computer down as much as I possibly could so that I could just barely see the words being typed on the screen. I put my hand on the keyboard and I just let it go. And my unconscious wrote this entire novel. I have no recollection of conjuring anything that came out of it. It came out almost full blown. So anyway, what have I done here? I have somehow knocked myself out of... Sorry. Somehow. Okay. guess I'm back. So, let's see. So, Sean, I think you could imagine, a room with a door, but then don't add more to it. Let whatever comes through the door come through the door, and make notes about what happens. And as I said, I just put my hands on the keyboard and I typed whatever came out. And what came out over 8 months was a novel. It was based on my experience, because I had spent 8 years in Japan, 3 years in high school, and 5 years in business. And so I knew a lot. And the novel is about the first woman prime minister of Japan, of which there has never been one, of course. Welcome, Gray and Death Metal Mason. There is a fear of getting lost within. Yes, that's very relevant, but you need to, it's worthwhile to have a life preserver like your wife or a girlfriend to pull you out of it. Gray says, Skip, discuss, if you don't mind, how our societal understanding of ego was not Jung's understanding presented in Ion. Okay, our societal understanding of ego, and Gray, correct me if you don't think I'm doing this right, but our societal view of ego is prideful, okay, that we are prideful individuals. I'm proud to be an American. I'm proud to be a Jungian, whatever it is. And it's a kind of arrogance. But from Dr. Jung's perspective, ego is everything that's in the conscious mind. And it emerges from the self, keeping in mind that in Jungian psychology, there are 2 centers. And when you're born, your ego is within the self. And so that's why babies are little kings and queens, because they think everything is about them. But gradually then your ego emerges from the self, and ideally you want to differentiate your ego and your conscious mind from your unconscious self, which is also called the God image. And let's see, Thomas, welcome. I just wanted to point out Thomas and Dennis is with us, and this is his new book, and it arrived this evening. I've not had an opportunity to really look at it. I sort of glanced through the first page. It looked interesting, but maybe I can report on it at a later date. So Grace says, that's important in encountering the unknown. Sean, I'm partly scared because my imagination is very vivid. Here's the thing. When you're going into the unconscious, it's like fishing, and you need to remember the fishing metaphor. And so if you start to pull up a fish that's too big for your boat, and your boat is your ego, then I highly recommend, and Dr. Edinger highly recommended, that you cut the string and let that one go. And so if you think that your unconscious is getting control of you, then let that go and don't push it, and wait until you're ready. And Grace says, you'd be foolish not to be scared. Don't let that stop you. Thomas says, would you call it automatic writing, Skip, the writing you did? Yes, it is a kind of automatic writing, because I had a very general idea of what I was going to write about. I would sit down at the keyboard, put my hands on the keys. I was trying not to wake myself up. I was trying to stay as much as possible in my dream level, or my ego pushed aside level. and then it just flowed out of my psyche and through my hands. And I've been typing for a good long time now, about 60 years, so I'm a good typist, and it just flows through me. Grenade says, the sphere, interesting. I've heard eight called the circumference. I've heard it called the circumference. The Tao says the master resides in the center of the circle. The Grenade says, I imagine the circle is the self and the center is the ego. Well, I mean, the center can also be the self. It just depends on how you look at it. And so Grace says, that's a very good imagination. I'm not sure what that refers to. Well done, Thomas. Thomas says, wow, thanks, Skip. Yep, that was the free plug for Thomas's book, Never Snickered a Snake on a Stick. And so we should all go out and order that from Amazon. Obviously, I've already done that. Death Metal says, we have a celebrity in our midst. Nice. Makes you wonder if the one is here. The one is definitely here, Death Metal Mason, because the one is everywhere. Gray says, he said he would be. Death Metal Mason says, care to elaborate? Thomas says, I don't get many plugs. Okay, so moving on. Okay, so we talked about Nebuchadnezzar and the fact that he had gotten himself too big for his britches, and his dream comes along and says, cut yourself down. You're operating way above your level, and there's lack of proportions. Your lack of proportions are very obvious, and therefore dreams often have this perspective value. So they can tell you if you're operating beyond what you can do. So I think, Sean, also you might have a dream that suggests that you might not be very wise to do that. And I don't know your age or how experienced you are, so I can't really advise except to say that you need to have a lot of life experience. And Dr. Jung, in his day, felt that was the age 35 or so is the right cutoff. Now, I know that most of you are under 35, and so I think that we are a bit more precocious than people were in Dr. Jung's day. In other words, in the 15th century, the average person was only exposed to as much information as appears in the Sunday New York Times, one issue. And so today we're exposed to a lot more information very fast from very many different cultures. And so we are growing up faster, and I'm sure that that's true. And there was this terrific TED Talk by this Indian guy who had put a laptop in a cubby in Chennai in Madras, and he left it there for the kids to play with. And he came back about 2 months later, and an 8-year-old looked up at him, smiled, and said, "We need a faster modem." So I think kids are learning a lot faster than they did in the old days. Gray says Matthew 18:12. Okay, let's see. Matthew 18:12. I probably can find that in due course here. So has anybody seen the movie or the television program Manifest, by the way? But before I get to that, Matthew 18:12 is, dun, 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 dun. What is your opinion? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, will he not leave the 99 in the hills and go in search of the stray? Okay. I'm not sure the point you were making, Gray. But anyway, the show Manifest keeps referring back to Romans 8:28. Let me go back to that. So I'm not sure whether this is a fundamentalist thing or not. It might be. It might be a fundamentalist come on, what they're doing with it. So in Manifest, the flight number of the airplane that disappears for 5.5 years is Flight 828. And then you keep running into things that have these numbers in them. And there was, on one of the programs, there was a cross-stitch on a sofa that said Romans 828. And so Romans 8:28 says, we know that all things work for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. And so it seems that the passengers of Flight 828 are somehow called, but whether this is going to be a fundamentalist come on where these miracles happen and they're selling Christianity, or whether it's going to be something else, is still an open question after 3 weeks of the program. Grace says 18:20, Matthew 18:20. So let me go back. Matthew 18:20. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. So absolutely, that's where the one is. Very good. That's a very good spot there, Gray. Thomas, yes, Thomas has gotten it before I did. Gray says, for where, yeah, all right. I believe Gray is referencing the chance that the Messiah or whatever would choose to consume through this method rather than books. I'm not, yeah. Today it would be through this method. I'm sure that's true. That makes more sense. Thomas says, the show sounds a little like the old series Lost. Okay, I never watched the old series Lost, so I don't know. But in any case, people keep doing miraculous things after they've disappeared for 5.5 years. From their perspective, they were flying for 2.5 hours, but when they land, they've been missing for 5.5 years, so whatever. It's modestly amusing still. Anyway, so in paragraph 496, Dr. Jung is talking about, again referring back to Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, people have a conscious attitude which is defective, and this is as regards an expression of their own character. These people are whose conscious attitude and adaptive performance exceed their capacities as individuals. And So what had come to my mind, and I'm going to keep it clean from a political point of view, but what had come to my mind was the Caine Mutiny with Humphrey Bogart. If you've never seen it, and some of you younger folks need to look it up on Turner Classic Movies, but it's called the Caine Mutiny. And in that movie, Humphrey Bogart plays a ship's captain whose command is taken away from him by his executive officer, and he goes off the deep end. And the point was that they appear better and more valuable than they really are. So then I wanted to read on from a certain place. Okay, I'm going to read a portion of paragraph 498. The greatest mistake an analyst can make is to assume that his patient has a psychology similar to his own. This projection may hit the mark once, but mostly it remains a mere projection. Everything that is unconscious is projected, and for this reason the analyst should be conscious of at least the most important contents of his unconscious, lest unconscious projections cloud his judgment. Everyone who analyzes the dreams of others should constantly bear in mind that there is no simple and generally known theory of psychic phenomena, neither with regard to their nature, nor to their causes, nor to their purpose. We therefore possess no general criterion of judgment. We know that there are all kinds of psychic phenomena, but we know nothing certain about their essential nature. We know only that though the observation of the psyche from any one isolated standpoint can yield valuable results, it can never produce a satisfactory theory from which one could make deductions. The sexual theory and the wish theory, that's Freud's theory. The sexual theory and the wish theory, like the power theory, that's Adler, are valuable points of view without, however, doing anything like justice to the profundity and richness of the human psyche. Had we a theory that did, we could then content ourselves with learning a method mechanically. It would then be simply a matter of reading certain signs that stood for fixed contents, and for this it would only be necessary to learn a few semiotic rules by heart, by a dream book, right? Knowledge and correct assessment of the conscious situation would then be as superfluous as in the performance of a lumbar puncture. The overworked practitioner of our day has learned to his sorrow that the psyche remains completely refractory. The psyche remains completely refractory to all methods that approach it from a single exclusive standpoint. At present, the only thing we know about the contents of the unconscious, apart from the fact that they are subliminal, is that they stand in a compensatory relationship to consciousness and therefore essentially relative. It is for this reason that knowledge of the conscious situation is necessary if we want to understand dreams. So I thought that was a pretty critical point. Right. So Death Metal Mason says, I believe Gray is referencing the chance that the Messiah or whatever would choose to consume through this method rather than books, and that makes more sense. Thomas says, the show sounds a little like the old series Lost, great movie. Grenade, wasn't Freud a cocaine addict? thought I heard that somewhere. Yes, he was. He had, Freud had cancer of the jaw, and he had a very serious operation where part of his jaw was actually removed, I think almost without help, but he finally ended up on cocaine for his pain, and that did make him an addict. This was later in his life, though. It wasn't when he was dealing with Dr. Jung, I don't think, because remember, Freud lived until 1939, and Dr. Jung's time with him was 1907 to 1913. Thomas says, the quote makes me think of transference and problems that can arise from that happening in analysis. If the analyst and the analysand get too close, it's not always fruitful. And the quote explains why dream books are pretty useless. Absolutely. You really have to understand where your conscious situation is, and then your dream may be compensating that situation. And so you have to think of the dream or the unconscious as a shapeshifter. And so in paragraph 497, Freud limits himself to reductive function. So Freud thinks that dreams are generated by your conscious life. And I think if you've been around this group for very long, you know that at least I don't think that, and I think a lot of Jungians do not think that. We think the unconscious is the 2-million-year-old man who knows better than we children. Thomas says, a biography of Freud I read had him using it at a fairly young age. I don't remember that. And most of my knowledge about Freud actually came from a historical novel by Irving Stone. I don't remember the name of it, but Irving Stone wrote it, and it was about Freud and his wife and their life together. It's a very good book, but I haven't read it for 30 years, so I don't remember it that well. But Thomas says he thinks it's before he met Jung. That may be, I don't know. And in those days, people were pretty, and especially doctors, were talking about the uses and abuses of drugs even then, but they weren't really very knowledgeable about what the dangers of taking these drugs were in those days. Grenade says, maybe that is why his theories are so focused on sex. Ha ha. Who knows? Death metal. It was a different time, Thomas. And Thomas says, cocaine was thought of as a wonder drug at that time and as a cure for morphine addiction. And indeed, the reason Coca-Cola is called Coca-Cola is because Coca-Cola used to have cocaine in it from coca. And so Thomas says, search Freud and cocaine and look at the article on Vice. I remember the novel about Freud, but didn't read it. Anyway, there is a audible book of that novel, so it's possible to read it while you're driving. A little more of my wife's honey. Okay. So Jung says about Freud's dream ideas, it limits itself to a reductive function. In other words, it's trying to explain your dreams based on what's happening in your conscious life. And his dream interpretation limits itself in essentials to the repressed personal background of the individual and its infantile sexual wishes, infantile claims to power, and superpersonal, archaic elements of thought, feeling, and instinct. The reproduction of such elements with their thoroughly retrospective character does more than anything else to undermine effectively a position that is too high and to reduce the individual to his human nullity and to his dependence on physiological, historical, and phylogenetic conditions. Every appearance of false grandeur and importance melts away before the reductive imagery of the dream, which analyses his conscious attitude with pitiless criticism and brings up devastating material containing a complete inventory of all of his most painful weaknesses. One is precluded at the outset from calling such a dream perspective, for everything in it, down to the last detail, is retrospective and can be traced back to the past which the dreamer imagined long since buried. Now, it could be an intended adaptation. The patient has an insuperable tendency to interpret the results of the analytical investigation of his material obstinately in terms of his pathogenic attitude. So if you tell somebody that they're having a Nebuchadnezzar dream and they ought to cut off the tree, then I'm sure that they might respond obstinately. Paragraph 498, such cases need the help of an analyst in order to interpret the dream correctly, not just the practical application of a method learned mechanically. The greatest mistake is to assume the analysand has a psychology similar to the analyst. Everything that is unconscious is projected. Now, on this point about similar to the analyst, we spoke this morning about the Myers-Briggs type indicator and the fact that based on those 4 scales, that 3 of which Dr. Jung invented in his lifetime, which are introvert, extrovert, sensing, intuitive, and thinking and feeling. And there's 2 more, judging and perceiving. If you use those 4 scales and put people on those 4 scales and assign 1 letter from each scale to individuals, you end up with 16 possible personality types. But within those personality types, there are very many shades of possibility. And so the result is you really have to know what type the person is in order to be able to understand their dreams. So, let's see. Thomas says, A Life for Our Time. Peter Gay is the biography I read with that info. Sean Steele says, speaking of that, heroin was a cough suppressor. Sean says, Chopin had consumption and was likely to take opium, which may have contributed to some of his works. Death Metal Mason, they're all just means of mounting various horses. The Grenade says, even today, the cough suppressant dextromethorphan is widely used, which is an extremely strong dissociative analgesic. Do not recommend anyone try it for recreational use. Horrible for mental health. Death Metal Mason says, one more capable of intense emotion likely wouldn't need it. Sean says, dangerous road of writer's block. And Stephen says, I have to leave. Thanks for your responses to my question. I'll join you again as I just subscribed. Great. Nice seeing you. Yeah, I think that creative people have to be very careful because they're looking for a connection into this stream of unconscious flow that Dr. Jung talked about. And if you've done it once, you know what it's like, and then you want to go back and do it again. Now, I believe it's very possible to do that consciously, to put yourself back in that flow. But a lot of people, and there are dozens of artists and novelists, writers of all kinds, who have become addicted to either alcohol or drugs, and they write amazing things for a period of time or paint amazing things for a period of time, and then they die. And so, one of my favorite examples is Jackson Pollock, who was the first artist to really get through to me. And I was very surprised by that, as many of you know. And, but, he became an alcoholic, and when he was 44 years old, he drove himself and two young women off a cliff and killed himself. Thomas says, it would seem to be almost impossible to teach folks to interpret their own dreams, wouldn't it? Of all the things folks are teaching, I don't see that so much, yet we could all benefit thereby. I think that the thing to teach people to do, Thomas, is to teach them to keep a dream journal. And I keep a dream journal, and I couldn't tell anybody else how to interpret their dream journal, but certainly I am able to interpret my dreams, or many of them, and if I can't, my wife, who's a genius Phi Beta Kappa, my wife can interpret them if I can't, because she knows me well enough to just get it. And so Sean says, careful not to sip from the stream of torment, laugh out loud, but from the stream of bliss. Well, there's a little of both, I'm afraid. It's both streams come out. And if you don't figure out a way to differentiate, you have a problem. So, anyway. Okay, moving on. Dr. Jung says there are all kinds of psychic phenomena, and we know nothing certain about their essential nature. The sexual theory and the wish theory, Freud, like the power theory, Adler, are valuable points of view without, however, doing anything like justice to the profundity and richness of the human psyche. If so, we could just read the signs. Okay, I guess I already covered that. So, paragraph 499, reductive, perspective, or simply compensatory dreams do not exhaust the possibilities of interpretation. And then he gets into the reaction dream, and this seems to me to be important. It reproduces an experience faithfully, and it could relate to the symbolic side of the experience, so it's presenting the experience as a symbol. But certain trauma, wartime events, for example, a trauma that is both psychic and a physical lesion in the nervous system, it's important to understand those because they do not change. And so if you have ever experienced PTSD, Let me go on here in paragraph 500. Important for the overall functioning of the psyche that the traumatic content loses its autonomy by frequent repetition. It resumes a proper place in the psychic hierarchy, but it cannot be called compensatory. The dream calmly goes into reproducing. And so this is where I said it's where PTSD comes up, because, even to this day, let's see, I left Vietnam 47 years ago, I believe, and 47 years ago, and yet, in the first summer I was back, I was out on a boat in the Niagara River, and we were going to watch the fireworks of the 4th of July. And when the fireworks began, I nearly jumped out of the boat. I had to physically constrain myself. And to this day, every time I hear fireworks or every time I hear a helicopter flying over me, I am immediately back in Vietnam. And I'm back in that environment. And so I can vouch from personal experience that these kind of events are there, and if they're triggered, they're very powerful. And one could hope that they would gradually, with repetition, resume their proper place in the psychic hierarchy. I suppose that they have in some sense, in the sense that and now I know what they are, and now I know what triggers them. And, but anyway, I think that's related to this issue. And Death Metal Mason says, although dreams may be a language best self-taught, I think basic knowledge of the metaphors contained a fairly universal thing, yes. And Bernard says Jung's work can be used to better understand the archetypes in dreams, and a lot of it in our genes. Absolutely, because what Dr. Jung was finding in his clinic was that his patients were having scenarios that matched the Greek myths. And so it was important to go back to the myths in order to understand what the archetypes are that play out through us. Thomas says, I would now say one makes oneself a visionary if that's what you really, really want by working soberly with one's inspirations. Grenade says, but for the most part, dreams are very personal. Depends on what level your soul is. The metaphors usually start simpler from what I've heard. My soul is at level 5. Joking. And then what? Death Metal says mine's at 9001. Thomas says, Skip, how closely connected do you think the trauma of PTSD is to dreaming? Once imprinted deeply in the emotions, they never go away and come again nightly. Well, I don't have dreams about those things, about helicopter rides and about explosions in the distance. So I don't have dreams about that, but they're definitely in my psyche, and they definitely trigger in those two circumstances. And mind you, I had an extremely mild experience in Vietnam compared to some of my classmates, and so I don't claim to any great heroism or anything like that in Vietnam, but I do, I did hear a lot of explosions, and I did hear a lot of helicopters, and it's those two sounds that do trigger me. And so because I know how mild my experience was and how those do trigger me, I'm very sensitive to veterans who have PTSD seriously, where it's debilitating, because I'm sure it would be debilitating. Sean says, I feel like you go into unconscious actively. It feels like Murphy's Law on a very slippery slope. Yes, it certainly can be that. And, again, it's the fishing metaphor. You have to feel your way a little bit and feel how big of a fish you can reel in. And if you realize that you're bringing in a fish that's too big for you, let it go. Don't pursue it. And I'm just curious, Sean or Grenade or Death Metal Mason, are any of you studying psychology, or are you psychotherapists? So you're giving us professional knowledge. I'd just be curious to know that. I am not a mental health professional, and I'm not claiming to be. I'm only giving my layman's reactions to Dr. Jung's work. Thomas says, certain traumas of my own, much less volatile than wartime experiences, but traumas nonetheless, do seem to reappear in my dream world. Okay, so in order to understand which this is, the reactive dreams, if the reactive dream is reproducing the trauma symbolically, then if the analysis is correct, then the dream goes away. But if it's a reactive reproduction, an actual reactive reproduction, as opposed to a symbol in a dream, then it is left undisturbed by the dream analysis. So, I've been analyzing my own dreams for many years, and that hasn't disturbed my reactive responses there. Okay, paragraph 502. Only exceptional cases when severe pain influences. Dr. Jung says that he doesn't feel that pain influences dreams very much. It becomes symbolic, and it's used as a means of expression, and it's a direct mimetic expression of the psychic situation, but a definite connection between physical and psychic disturbances, it's generally underrated. But it can be boundlessly overrated, as in Christian Science, where I don't know anything about Christian Science, so I will not comment there. Grenade says, I'm a computer information systems manager, not any sort of professional. That sounds professional to me, but all truths are half true. Take what I say with a giant grain of salt. Sean says, no, I'm just very curious of human nature. Thomas says, I knew a man who was confined to a wheelchair for many years who told me that in his dreams he was leaping and flying about quite often, as high as telephone poles. I guess this is a compensation. It sounds like it to me, yes. And Sean says, Jung in one of the passages said compensatory. Yeah, compensatory dreams, right. And Grenade says, maybe I've had flying dreams before, though. Maybe I'm compensating for not having wings. And it's very common for women, by the way, to have flying dreams. And Death Metal says, I fly in all of my dreams, almost without exception. That's interesting. I don't expect you to answer, but you ought to ask yourself what that means to you, and not to anybody else. So dreams throw interesting sidelights on the interfunctioning of body and psyche, which is why Dr. Jung raises this issue. And then he starts talking about telepathy. And in 503, telepathy can be another dream determinant. And Dr. Jung says its authenticity can no longer be disputed. And I don't know if you have experiences with telepathy, but telepathy has been asserted from ancient times, but it cannot be unqualified assent. You have to look at parallels, and it possibly might be cryptomnesia, which is having an experience which you forget, and then it comes back through a dream. And in 504, Dr. Jung was talking about his own experiences with telepathy, and especially coming up at the time of death. And he certainly recounts in Memories, Dreams, Reflections several occasions when he became aware of a death without having been told. And on one occasion, one of his grandsons almost drowned in his boathouse while he was away, and he had a premonition about that. And he claims to not have a theoretical opinion about that, but that it does happen. And I would say that, that's telepathy also works through the collective unconscious. I think you can find a lot on it, and you can experience it yourself. I mean, my wife and I once went to a weekend conference on ESP, extrasensory perception, and what that conference proved to me is that ESP is just routine. It happens all the time. Let's see. So Sean says, it sounds like you can't articulate how your heart feels to the people close around you, but that's just my take, first thought. Grenade says, or maybe you just think telekinesis powers would be super dope. Thomas says, telepathy between spouses seems fairly common, very definitely. You can finish each other's sentences after a period of time. And Grenade says, only you can truly know what your dreams are telling you. Absolutely. And Death Metal Mason says, it is. I'm the vessel meant to be eventually capable of fully containing God's life. And Sean says, when I was a child, I feared that my teachers had telepathy. And they probably did, and knew what you were thinking too. And Death Metal Mason says that it's absurdly hard to communicate. I never approach it that way, obviously. So anyway, let's put it this way. I think that telepathy is a thing. And I'm not a mental health professional, but I've had plenty of experiences of finishing my wife's sentences and vice versa. And just knowing when something was going to happen, that's very common in my own life, but that's from a layman's perspective. So in paragraph 505, Dr. Jung is saying that unlike Freud, who felt that dreams were about wish fulfillment, what Dr. Jung says is the dream is a spontaneous self-portrayal in symbolic form of the actual situation in the unconscious. So it's expressing to you what the actual situation is right now. Death Metal Mason says, I understand how the fundamental layers of reality are the same as dreams, and how that allows for God's kingdom to manifest on earth. I think that's one that I want to reserve comment on for the time being. As a young lad, you don't want your thoughts on display, Sean says. Death Metal Mason, but just because I can understand it doesn't mean I can explain it in a way anyone understands. To be fair, Sean. Okay, well, that's fair enough. A lot of us cannot say what we feel. That's very hard. So, paragraph 506, Dr. Jung says the dream is a symbolic representation of unconscious content, and so therefore sexual language of dreams is not always to be interpreted in a concretistic way. It's an archaic language which naturally uses all of the analogies readiest at hand without their necessarily coinciding with a real sexual content. When you take the sexual metaphors as symbols for something unknown, your conception of the nature of the dreams at once deepens. The concretistic misconception is dropped. So, in other words, Dr. Jung was saying that Freud wasn't going deep enough, that if you have a sexual dream, it might be talking about something completely different from sexuality, and it may be that your unconscious is simply taking that imagery or that method of communicating with you as a symbol to try to communicate its message to you. Okay, I'm going to leave part of that private conversation silent. Paragraph 507, no scientific test between perception and reality. We tend to assume that the world is as we see it. And you know how assume is spelled, ASS-U-me. And so we assume people are as we imagine them to be, projecting our unconscious on others. They become an imago or a carrier of imagos or symbols. For example, Madame Bovary, who was a shapeshifter, anima figure, and all the men fell in love with her. We see our own unavowed mistakes in our opponents. Unless we have great self-awareness, we always project because the psyche expects us to do so. And that's where participation mystique comes from. And so I think that may be as far as I got here. Another interesting point that Dr. Jung makes in paragraph 507 is that all human relationships swarm with these projections. Anyone who cannot see this in his personal life need only have his attention drawn to the psychology of the press in wartime. So, and then in paragraph 508, the frequency such projections is as certain as the fact that they are never seen through. Okay. Okay, so that's as far as I'm prepared for tonight. So I'm going to discontinue the further discussion of this essay now, but we'll continue other discussion. This essay still drones on for another 16 pages, and it gets very complex near the end, so I'm going to leave that for next week. Let's see. So Sean says, I've had dreams where people I knew closely didn't recognize who I was, even though I pleaded to them. Well, first of all, if I understand correctly, all the people in a dream are actually you. And so the fact that that person doesn't recognize you means that it seems to me that it means that it's one of your complexes that doesn't recognize you, but it's not the actual person you know in real life. That person is just an image that your psyche grabbed to use in your dream. And so... Little Gumnut says, I think when lucid dreaming, it can be about wish fulfillment. I can recall being able to will desirable objects into existence. I won't say what these objects were, but isn't it obvious? Well, certainly, a standard technique of many traditions is to envision what you want and think about it. And so lots of us have envisioned that we would have the house of our dreams or the car of our dreams or the boat of our dreams. And if we keep visioning in that way, we make decisions in our life that lead us that way. But then you get to the point of the 63-foot yacht with the name Never Enough, and you realize that all of those material items are not what brings happiness. And so you can dream about them all you like, and you can materialize them in your life, but they aren't going to bring you happiness. Thomas says, by the way, as a writer, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one of my favorite words, a synonym for related to dreams. It's oneirotic, and it's an adjective from the Greek oneieros. I don't know if I've spelled it right or pronounced it right. It's Oneiric, and the Greek is Oneiros. Okay, so related to dreams. Little Gumnut says, I tend to buy that it's largely compensatory when not lucid. Yes, Death Metal Mason says, yes, but when you learn to become lucid, then dissociate from the being perceived in the dream, it becomes more like a movie, a very valuable learning too. And I was having dreams where it was like being in the control room of a television studio where there were like 16 different screens on the wall, and I was called upon to select which screen I wanted to have in my dream, and I kept having that repeatedly. So I was getting to choose my dreams. So Thomas says dream interpreters could be called onerotic critics. Onerocritics, okay? Grenade says, I always wake up when I realize I'm dreaming. It's hard to fight it. Death Metal says that's attachment. Well, if you wake up, write them down, and then work on them when you're awake in the morning. Sean says, I have a problem detaching from the dreams because I'm sort of a sucker for great stories. I'd rather play along and be blind. And so, fair enough. I mean, I know I sometimes try to stay in dreams, and when I wake up, I try to quickly go back and review the dream before I get up or turn on a light or do anything that wakes me up, to try to tack it down in my conscious mind so I have time to write it down. And usually I only get a few scraps, and any detail that you can remember about a dream is a good detail to write down, no matter what it is, whether it's a color or an animal or a type of leaf on a tree or whatever it is. Write it down, because your psyche is presenting that to you, whatever it is. So, okay, what do we get up to? It's 9:40. Okay, so really, we have done a full session here. Anything else that we want to talk about? I think, Thomas, that after we get to the end of this essay, General Aspects of Dream Psychology, it was my impression that Dr. Jung really went off the rails in this essay and went on talking about an entirely different topic, which skips my mind at the moment. That's why I have to go back and do notes on it. I will put my notes from today in the Dropbox. And so I think that after I complete this essay, I hope to do that next week with 16 more pages to go. And then I would like to think in terms of moving on to something other than dreams for a period of time. It's not to say that there are not more dreams and dream information in this book, C.G. Jung Dreams, and I can urge you all to purchase the book and read all the essays without my droning through them. But I don't want to have everything the same. There's one very interesting dream sequence in here, but it happens to also be in Psychology and Alchemy, and it's the dream sequence of Wolfgang Pauli, who was a Nobel Prize winner in physics, who communicated with Dr. Jung for many years. There's a book called Atom and Archetype, which contains the letters between Drs. Pauli and Dr. Jung, where they were looking for the commonality between physics and quantum mechanics and archetypes. And it's a very interesting book. And so later in this book that we've been reading, and also in Psychology and Alchemy, is this series of dreams that Dr. Jung was working with Pauli during his individuation process. And it was a series of dreams that I think came in over like a 10-year period, but it really showed his individuation process. And so it's a very complex set of dreams, and I don't want to just talk about it out of the clear blue sky. I want to have some work up to that set of dreams. And so I think we'll hold that off until I can work up the courage to go all the way through psychology and alchemy. And that is a major undertaking. It would take several months to complete, but it represents, that book is actually a history of the human psyche from earliest times up till when Dr. Jung died, or when he finished writing that book, in any case. So Thomas says, I wonder if anyone has heard the stories of the temples of Aesculapius, where ancient Greeks went to incubate or induce dreams. I've certainly heard of it, but don't know much more about it. Little Gumnut says, after reading Man and His Symbols, perhaps as a result of lending credence to visions, I can remember almost hallucinating and seeing snakes, etc. Wondering if any of you guys can relate to that. I certainly can, because my experience in 1993 happened subsequent to reading Man and His Symbols every night for a year to my wife. I would read 3 or 4 pages a night every night for most of a year. And at the end of it, I felt I had had psychotherapy, but also it was after that I started to have my visions. And Thomas says, participants slept on stone slabs off the floor on which harmless types of snakes were allowed to wander freely. And Death Metal Mason says, I waved at you on Facebook, Skip. I'd very much like to hear more about your dreams and experiences when you have some time. Well, you can certainly write to me either on Facebook or in my regular email address, which is skip.conover@gmail.com. I'm willing to have conversations with people, but only with the understanding that I am not a mental health professional. I'm a knowledgeable reader of Jung from a layman's perspective, and so I can relate to you as a layman, but not as a mental health professional. And so let's see. Death Metal Mason says, that sounds similar to a technique I use to keep my conscience partially activated while sleeping. Mine is just sleeping on my couch naked without blankets, though. I think that Dr. Jung said in these passages that if you do light sleep, you're more likely to remember your dreams. And for example, I did my meditation group today, and what happens to me without fail almost every week, because the meditation comes in the middle of the day, and I start my day at 6 a.m. And today I also did a 2.5-hour reading before I went to my meditation group. And so as soon as we meditate, I go, ugh. And so it's very light sleep, but it's very common for me to have 4 or 5 short sleep periods, each with different dreams during my meditation. And so you can catch dreams by sleeping lightly. Thomas says, thanks again, Skip, and I hope you enjoy my book. When you have time to read it, don't be put off by the yoga in the book. Well, I won't be put off by the yoga in the book. I guess Thomas, Jung made some rather interesting comments about yoga, and saying that people in the West shouldn't do yoga. And I think that he was maybe living at a time when yoga was not well known in the West. And so he was trying to hold it at arm's length, I think. But it's interesting to me to see that, my wife and I did yin yoga classes at my local gym a while back. We did it for like 10 months. And it turns out that the yoga teachers are really teaching Hinduism. I don't know if they even know that, but anyway, I said, man, they're yoga teachers in Nebraska. And so, Sean says, have you ever awakened in the middle of the night and heard lightning in your head? No, I never did. A large buzzing drowned out all other sounds. That's something that is a symptom, and I wouldn't comment on that, Sean. So Thomas says, the history of yoga in the West and in Europe is a rather mixed story. There were fakirs and fakers, absolutely. And there are plenty of people that are trying to fake, even in what they're doing with Dr. Jung now. And I can include with that certain Jungian analysts. Little Gumnut says, Sean, that's happened to me a few times. It's a loud banging sound that usually occurs as I'm just about to fall asleep, typically when my sleep schedule is messed up. Thomas says, I've been practicing almost 20 years, but the yin yoga is one of my favorite classes too. We were enjoying it very much, and then I went and got my knee replaced, so I had to cut it out, and we never got back to it. I think we probably will when my wife officially retires next August. Then I'm going to drag her back into the gym. And it's more fun when we do it together, because then we can talk about the teacher behind her back and know what we're talking about. And probably a lot of the other people wouldn't really even have any clue what we're talking about. I do thank you, Sean, for suggesting that I get the tea and honey, because that has been very helpful this evening. And so one of the things I want to urge all of you to do is to listen to the Mysterium Encounter, and also listen to Dr. Jung's commentary and to the reading of the footnotes. I think that's a very interesting passage, and it relates also to chapter 5 of Psychological Types, which is volume 6 of Dr. Jung's oeuvre. So Thomas says, I always see the physical stuff of yoga as setting up to sit in meditation. I know that that's helpful, and I agree with that. I think that the reason I do meditation is to try to allow my unconscious to have space to communicate with me. And so I'm doing it a little bit differently from what my Buddhist friends are doing. They want to go to nullity, to nirvana, and I don't think that that's necessarily a good idea, and I worry very much. That Buddhism tends to make very passive people, which maybe is required. I mean, I had a friend at one point who observed that, Hinduism and Buddhism have made it so that about 1.6 billion people can survive on $1 a day or a couple of dollars a day nowadays. When I started going to India in 1994 for business, and I've been there 44 times since then, but when I started, the average annual income was about $1 a day per capita. And so now it's a bit more. It might be $2 or $3 a day. And in Pakistan, it's a little higher than that. And in Bangladesh, it's a little lower than that. But these religions, Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, all have allowed for people to see life as an illusion, and therefore they're not feeling they have to strive within the life. And especially if you're born an untouchable and you can't be anything but an untouchable during your lifetime, at least you know you'll be reborn and maybe can move up the ladder. But Thomas says, I always keep a notebook near when meditating in case of what I call a creative eruption. One has to make meditation one's own. We all do it for different reasons, it seems. I agree with that entirely, and I think that that's an excellent idea. I don't personally bother taking notes when I'm in my meditation group because I'm meditating with 5 women psychologists who are not Jungians, and I don't want to have to explain to them what I'm doing, and they might not get it. Thomas says, modern India has some really intense problems today, for sure. And, we're all facing really intense problems that we maybe haven't faced up to yet. I mean, Hurricane Michael is certainly an indication of that, as is Hurricane Florence. And in India, one of the issues is that the Chinese have put 17 dams in the Himalayas in the headwaters of the Ganges River. And the Ganges River supports with water about 300 million people. And so one could imagine that if the Chinese wanted to cut off the Ganges, you could easily have a major cataclysmic war over there. And so it's always a concern. But India is coming along, and it's improved quite a lot in the 25 years that I've been going there. I remember when I was first flying into then Madras, before it reverted its name back to Chennai. When I was first flying into Madras, and normally coming from the west, you'd arrive in India at night. And when I was first coming in, you could almost see no lights at all. Maybe you could probably count a half a dozen lights outside the airport in the middle of the night at 2 or 3 in the morning. But each time I went after that, and for every 2 months or so, I was going to India in those days, and I would see more and more lights going off into the distance. And the growth of India has been truly remarkable, just in what I've seen over the years. I actually started a business there in a building that the only business in the building. It was a 10-story building and about, I'd say, something like 40,000 square feet per floor. It was a big building, and we had a corner of one floor, so we had about 10,000 square feet. We were the only business in that building, and they were literally building the building around us, something that could never happen in the United States because nobody would allow occupancy in a building that's not finished construction. But we were literally in our space communicating with the U.S. from Madras, and we had a satellite dish on the roof, and the whole rest of the building was still under construction, and women were literally carrying bricks up to the higher floors of the building on their head on top of their hard hats. So they literally had a normal construction hard hat, except it had a little boundaries on the top of it, so you could put a brick in that, and they would pile 3 or 4 bricks on top of that, and they would carry that on their head. And so they'd carry 4 bricks up the stairs, and the stairs were crumbling. It's just, it was amazing to see what they were doing. But they have built a lot of impressive buildings now in India, and so someday I hope to return, but not today. Anyway, all right, I guess I'll call this to a halt. We've been going 2 hours, and I went 2.5 hours this morning, so I hope you all take a look at Mysterium Encounter. Little Gumnut says, "It seems like Buddhism offers relief independent of one's environment, and as such does away with the desires of the body. It's not a tenable solution to deny your instincts." And I'm not an expert, so not totally sure. I think there's truth to what you're saying there, basically those religions taught people to be satisfied with what they had, however little that was. And it's a system that worked, and it worked very well. And it created a large population of people that are willing to do that. And I don't know where it all ends, because we know that we can't have a world where everyone lives like suburban America lives. That just wouldn't and couldn't happen. And so how we finally balance things out in the world is going to be a long-term issue. It's a 1,000-year question. It's not a question for solution tonight, but it's a big question, and it's a question where the collective psychology is very important to understand, and that's my big interest in doing this work, which I'm trying to do. So anyway, I'm going to discontinue the stream at this point, and I look forward to seeing some of you again soon. We'll be having our advanced reading group on Wednesday, as usual, at 1:30 p.m. If you're not a member of our advanced reading group and you would like to be, you are welcome to send me an email to skip.conover@gmail.com so that I can get you into the advanced group Dropbox, and there you can see all of the sessions. We've now had 20 seminar sessions on Ion, which is Dr. Jung's, one of his later books, which is touted to be a commentary on the Red Book. From my perspective, I'm not quite seeing that, but the combination of Dr. Jung's book and Dr. Edinger's book called The Ion Lectures has been quite interesting and useful. And so, and one of the important chapters, chapter 5, is called Christ as a symbol of the self. And so just understanding that took several weeks. And so all the videos for that are available in our Dropbox, but they are not on YouTube because we've been doing that seminar on Zoom as a video conference. So anyway, if you'd like to join the advanced reading group, please let me know. We'd be happy to have you, and all of the seminar sessions from the beginning are in that the advanced group's Dropbox. So anyway, I look forward to seeing you again next week, and I probably will be on undefined times to do some more readings over the next week, but probably not tomorrow. I'll probably rest my voice tomorrow. So peace.